Was justice served or not? What's going on, guys? I'm Chris and welcome back to another video. So today I've got my review of Kung Fu Panda 4. This is the fourth film in the series that has become a hit franchise for Dreamworks over the past few years. But before I give you guys my thoughts on this film, be sure to hit that like button and comment your expectations or predictions down below, as well as your thoughts if you've actually seen this movie. Subscribe to that notification bell to help reach my new goal of 150,000 subscribers here on the channel. And as always, be sure to go show some love to the Unusual Couple podcast. New episode dropped today where we talked about the Oscars. And real quick, if you guys want to watch through movies and shows with me, you can do so on my Patreon for $5 a month. I'm currently rewatching Stranger Things and dropping commentary tracks over there, and I'll get into other movies and shows as time goes by. So I'd love to have you in the Patreon community. Your support over there means a lot. So quick background for me when it comes to Kung Fu Panda. I watched the first two films years ago when it had been well over a decade, and I rewatched them the other night in preparation, and I loved them both. The third film I watched for the first time the other day, and I thought it was solid, but definitely a bit of a step down. So going into the fourth film, I had moderate expectations. I was excited to revisit this world. I saw the movie last night in an early press screening. I walked out and I was a little underwhelmed. In fact, I have a lot to say, but I'm going to start with the pros, the positive takeaways from this movie. And the big shining light in Kung Fu Panda 4, without a doubt, is Jack Black as Po. He owns this role, and I would argue it might just be his most iconic role at this point in his career. I know he's got School of Rock, he's Tenacious D. You could say lots of films for Jack Black, but over the 4-film run that he's had as Po, he's cemented himself as a Dreamworks animated legend. And if it's not his most iconic role, it's gotta be in the conversation for the role he's the most associated with, or at least his most memorable. And it's just him doing voice work. That's what makes it all the more impressive. Jack Black is Po. That is solidified after this movie. His character's both lovable and over the top, as always, delivering on multiple lines that will make you chuckle and warm your heart simultaneously. In fact, one of my biggest praises for this movie is that the voice cast across the board is stellar. You've got Bryan Cranston returning as Po's birth father, James Hong is back as his adoptive father, but then you've also got Ian McShane returning as Tai Lung in this film, and I'm not going to say too much regarding that character. I'll get into that later, but Ian McShane has one of those voices that just commands the screen. When you hear him speak, your ears perk up a little. You're like, oh, I have to hear what this man has to say. But there's a lot of newcomers here as well. You've got Awkwafina taking on one of the bigger roles in the film, as her and Po sort of headline this new adventure in the world of Kung Fu Panda. And Awkwafina's hit or miss for a lot of people. For me, some of the humor was missing the mark, but there's no denying she's got one of those instantly recognizable voices, and some of her certain line deliveries will probably get a giggle out of you. There weren't any big belly laughs associated with this movie. I'll get into more of that later in this video when it comes to some of the cons, but Awkwafina is, you know, solid enough in her role. And then in terms of the villain in this film, we've got Viola Davis taking on the voice role, and she's someone who was born to play villainous characters. She obviously crushes it as Amanda Waller, but in this film, she's just got one of those voices similarly to Ian McShane, where she speaks, you listen, it's commanding, it's threatening, it's menacing, and she delivered in terms of voice acting. Now, this is a Dreamworks animated film, so obviously the animation is going to be amazing, and yet again, they deliver. In fact, animation as a whole right now is the best it's ever been. You've got Pixar, Disney, Dreamworks, and then, you know, you've got Sony crushing it with the Spider-Verse films. Animation has never looked better, and I'm curious to see how it can continue to improve, because it feels like it's at its peak right now in terms of just being so visually stunning. But then you look back 10, 15 years ago, and we thought that stuff was just the most innovative animation out there. So 10, 15 years from now, I imagine it will look even more hyper-realistic and gorgeous. And aside from the technical aspects of this film, as well as the performances the voice actors give, of course, this movie has a charming nature to it. It's designed to be a movie for families, for the little kids to enjoy, and I can safely say it'll be one of those movies that families across the world end up loving and watching, you know, on movie night for years to come, probably. So there will undeniably be fans of this movie. I don't know if I can call myself one of them, though, because now we gotta talk about my cons with this film, and unfortunately I think they outweigh the positive elements this movie has to offer. Perhaps my biggest issue is that emotionally this movie is lacking. It doesn't have the weight or depth, emotionally speaking, of the first two films in particular, and that is felt. And I think we are sorely missing certain character dynamics from those first three films in this fourth entry, and it's unforgivable in my opinion. It's like stripping the film franchise of its heart You've got an unconventional family story going for 3 films with Po and his companions, and this movie is just really missing certain elements that held up the first 3 films, and I was questioning the entire time, why aren't we seeing more of certain characters? It baffled me. I don't get it. There's a decision the film makes too that's laughable and borderline offensive as to why some characters don't have as prominent of a role in the film. It felt like a big slap in the face to certain actors, and I was just like, wow, that's what we're doing? It kind of pissed me off, to be honest with you. So while that did rub me the wrong way, I can look past it a bit, but then I have to take a step back and realize this film of the 4 is without a doubt the one that's the most targeted to the youngest audience. The first 3 Kung Fu Panda films are family fun films that kids can take a lot out of, but adults can really enjoy as well because thematically they're rich, and you watch Po go on this journey over the course of the film where he changes as a character. He develops as a panda. I almost said human, but you get what I'm trying to say. As a character, he is strengthened over the course of the film because of the relationships with those around him and his different trials and tribulations. And in this 4th film, unfortunately, the character development and the storytelling take a back seat, and it's almost like they put the emphasis on trying to have every other scene be a laugh out loud moment with lowbrow humor that's simply unfunny. It's lacking that clever wit that a lot of the other films have, and so there were crickets a lot of the times in my audience just because it's humor that doesn't really click for anyone. I mean, it's really bottom of the barrel type stuff, and that's unfortunate because the other 3 Kung Fu Panda films have some humor that can really get some big laughs out of you, and this movie was desperately missing that. It could have used the juice in terms of humor, and it just wasn't packing those big punches. And I'm gonna come right out and say it, the villain in this movie is weak. In fact, of the 4 films, by far the weakest villain is in this movie. Viola Davis is giving it her all, and there's no denying she has the voice of a villain, but there has to be some backstory to buy in, and I felt like there was nothing. It's almost like they developed this menacing design for a villain and a really cool concept, but that's all they had. They didn't have any meat on the bone. It was just, here's the design of a character, but there's nothing inside. It's kind of like in the world of sports, specifically American football, when there's like an offensive lineman who's like 7 feet tall and like 350 pounds. You're like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be impossible to get past this guy on the offensive line when you're playing defense, and he's just a big marshmallow who you can run right over. That's kind of how I feel about this villain. Scary on the outside, not so much going on the inside. I'm gonna put it this way, originality in this film do not vibe. There's nothing new in this movie in terms of the Kung Fu Panda world, or just in terms of animated films in general. By the time we get to the 3rd act, the movie becomes a copy and paste of so many other generic big blockbuster films we've seen. Like, parts of this movie were eerily reminiscent of the 3rd acts of DCEU movies, and I just sat there in shock, almost like, we had a good thing going for a bit here, but then it just got derailed by trying to create another big battle for no apparent reason. And I was surprisingly underwhelmed by the action sequences in this film. There weren't many, for starters, but when they would happen, I was underwhelmed. There was not like a standout action scene like I can pinpoint one from each of the other 3 films, and here I was like, there's nothing to write home about, really. And I think a reason I feel that way is because so many of these action sequences that we did get felt repetitive. They would just continue to overextend their stay, and it really made it hard as a viewer to feel the stakes because it was just like, oh, here we go again. And I will say this much to the diehard Kung Fu Panda fans out there. Manage your expectations if you've watched the marketing for this movie, because certain characters who they may or may not have set up to return are underutilized here. It almost feels gimmicky in terms of the way this film was marketed, so I just want to put that warning out there for some of you guys so you can temper your expectations a bit. It doesn't bring me any joy to say this, but this movie doesn't have the heart of the first 3 Kung Fu Panda films, and at times it doesn't even feel like a Kung Fu Panda movie because so much of what makes those first 3 movies is missing here. It's almost like this movie was too late in the game. It doesn't feel necessary to Poe's story. So while there is enjoyment to be had, you've got Jack Black doing his shtick throughout the whole film. It's only an hour and a half, so it does fly by for the most part until the 3rd act, which surprisingly dragged. There are moments to enjoy. You've got gorgeous animation. You are back in the world of Kung Fu Panda, and you've you've got Master Shifu in the picture, and so you've got some sort of classic Kung Fu Panda moments. It just kind of feels like a shell of what the franchise once was. Overall, Kung Fu Panda 4 just lacks the emotional maturity of the first two films and parts of the third. It's not like it's offensively bad or anything, I just thought the movie was shockingly mediocre, and that word should never be used to describe a Kung Fu Panda movie. But that does it for my honest review of Kung Fu Panda 4. Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below, as well as your predictions or expectations if you've not yet seen it. Hit that like button, subscribe, and hit that notification bell if you haven't already to be notified for all my future videos. And if you want to watch Stranger Things with me or other movies and shows, you can do so on my Patreon link down below. For $5 a month, I drop commentary tracks. I've got some exclusive live Q&As. It's a fun time, and I'd love to have you guys join the community over there. But that's going to do it. Thank you guys as always, and until next time, I'll see you guys later.